It is a sweltering July in 1994, buried deep inside the heavily guarded subterranean command center of a multi-billion-dollar aerospace conglomerate. Seven of the most brilliant, highly decorated engineering minds on the planet are locked inside a windowless conference room, tasked with solving a catastrophic engine failure on a flagship orbital launch vehicle. They possess practically unlimited operational funding. They have direct access to the most advanced computational hardware of the era. Yet within 72 hours, the room violently devolves into a toxic, deeply paranoid battleground. Massive egos clash over microscopic technical details, vital telemetry data is weaponized to prove colleagues wrong, and the incredibly narrow launch window violently closes, instantly incinerating $500 million in capital and years of meticulous labor. Why did seven verified geniuses produce the collective output of absolutely zero? The answer lies not in their mathematical competency, but in an invisible, deeply misunderstood architecture that governs every single human interaction on Earth. Let's strip away the meaningless corporate buzzwords, ignore the superficial retreat schedules, and completely decode the volatile, high-stakes psychology of team building. Long before it was cheaply packaged into awkward corporate retreats and mandated trust falls in hotel lobbies, team building was a brutal, uncompromising mechanism of absolute survival. 200,000 years ago, the hostile, unforgiving prehistoric landscape did not reward individual, isolated genius. It aggressively rewarded synchronized, collective output. The solitary hunter, no matter how physically imposing, how fast, or how tactically brilliant they were with a primitive spear, inevitably starved, froze, or became prey to apex predators. Pure survival required the complete suppression of the individual ego in favor of the tribe. This primitive blueprint remained largely intact for millennia, driving massive agricultural revolutions, funding early trade empires, and building the colossal monuments of antiquity. But the ruthless machine of the Industrial Revolution fundamentally ruptured this ancient dynamic. By the late 19th century, sprawling smoke-choked factories arose across the landscape, and human beings were systematically downgraded from highly collaborative tribe members to isolated, completely interchangeable cogs. Imagine the environment: the deafening, rhythmic crash of heavy iron looms, the suffocating smell of burning coal and machine oil. A wealthy, iron-fisted industrialist of the era famously noted that he simply wanted hands to work, not heads to think. Workers were profoundly alienated, stationed rigidly on endless assembly lines where they repeated a single, mind-numbing mechanical motion hundreds of times an hour, specifically barred from socializing or collaborating. The psychological toll of this isolation was catastrophic. By the early 20th century, factory productivity began to flatline. Sabotage, massive strikes, and absolute soul-crushing apathy infected the factory floors. In the mid-20th century, a quiet, desperate panic began rippling through executive boardrooms. The wealthy lords of industry realized that a vast collection of isolated, deeply depressed individuals could never optimize a complex system. They desperately needed a synthetic substitute for the primal tribe. Thus began the incredibly clumsy, highly forced era of modern team building. It started as crude psychological experiments. They hired expensive behavioral psychologists to analyze the workers like lab rats, measuring their responses to artificial stress. They timed their puzzle-solving skills, meticulously recording every interaction on clipboards, completely missing the human element. The workers deeply resented these experiments, viewing them not as an opportunity to bond, but as yet another invasive metric used by management to evaluate their worth. The corporate mandate was entirely backwards. They falsely believed that simply putting people in close physical proximity and forcing them to interact would magically generate deep trust. They focused entirely on the superficial mechanics of the task, completely ignoring the underlying neurochemistry of the human brain. Trust is not a mechanical switch that can be casually flipped by a weekend retreat. It is a complex, fragile neurobiological state deeply reliant on the suppression of the amygdala. To truly understand the precise mechanics of elite group dynamics, we have to look entirely past the superficial team-building exercises and examine the raw, unfiltered architecture of psychological safety. Let's dissect the intense environment of an ultra-high-performing surgical unit operating inside a global trauma center. When a critically injured, heavily bleeding patient is rushed through the swinging double doors, there is absolutely no time for ego, hierarchical grandstanding, or hesitation. The room smells of sharp antiseptics and metallic blood. The rhythmic beeping of the EKG machine sets the tempo for the room. The blinding overhead lights illuminate an intricate dance of stainless steel instruments passing between gloved hands. The lead surgeon does not bark tyrannical orders into a vacuum. They rely on a hyper-calibrated network of anesthesiologists, nurses, and technicians who operate with an almost terrifying telepathic synchronicity. This flawless execution is not the result of a naturally friendly personality dynamic. It is the result of a heavily engineered culture of absolute psychological safety. In these high-stakes environments, the penalty for speaking up about a potential error is exactly zero, while the penalty for staying silent is catastrophic death. When a junior nurse notices a slight millimeter drop in a heart rate monitor, they do not pause to anxiously consider if pointing it out will offend the massive ego of the senior surgeon. They speak immediately, loud and clear. Because the culture protects them, the brain's fear center, the amygdala, remains entirely quiet. This allows the prefrontal cortex, the center for high-level problem-solving, rapid logic, and critical analysis, to operate at maximum processing capacity. Cortisol, the toxic stress hormone that physically degrades cognitive function and aggressively narrows our field of vision to immediate, selfish threats, is minimized. In its place, the brain receives steady, powerful drips of oxytocin and dopamine, powerful chemical compounds that enhance pair bonding, pattern recognition, and long-term strategic execution. If you are deeply obsessed with decoding the invisible psychological frameworks that dictate human behavior and shape the reality of our modern world, hit that subscribe button. We decode highly complex systems like this every single week. Now, returning to the invisible mechanics of the group, contrast the elite, high-functioning surgical unit with a hyper-competitive, deeply toxic sales floor of a cutthroat financial firm. Imagine the chaos. The abrasive hum of the ventilation system is entirely drowned out by the chaotic roar of shouting voices. Men and women in expensive, tailored suits scream into headsets, their eyes darting frantically across constantly updating ticker symbols. In this highly volatile environment, team building is purely performative theater. Management might mandate a forced Friday evening social event with cheap drinks, but the underlying structure of the organization strictly rewards hoarding vital information, brutal backstabbing, and ruthless zero-sum competition. In these spaces, cortisol runs absolutely rampant. The human brain interprets the modern workplace not as a supportive tribe, but as a dangerous territory populated by rival predators. Information becomes pure currency, kept tightly locked away in private servers to secure personal advancement. When a massive financial failure occurs, the immediate reflex is not collaborative problem-solving, but incredibly aggressive blame-shifting to protect one's own precarious status. Elite team building, therefore, is not an event, an activity, or a corporate retreat. It is the deliberate architectural design of a systemic environment where the perceived risk of interpersonal vulnerability is completely eradicated. It requires the systemic dismantling of the ego by the leadership itself. When a powerful leader openly admits a severe miscalculation to their team without any defensive posturing, they send a massive psychological shockwave through the entire organizational hierarchy. They establish a radical new baseline, proving through action that fallibility is not fatal. This single, highly vulnerable act initiates a rapid cascade of reciprocal vulnerability. Suddenly, the heavy, invisible armor that every member wears into the room begins to crack and fall away. They stop expending massive amounts of mental energy scanning the environment for threats and protecting their social status, immediately reallocating all of that computational processing power directly toward the collective objective. The true absolute breakthrough in understanding group dynamics was the scientific realization that human beings are deeply intuitive, highly sensitive status calculators. We are constantly, subconsciously evaluating our exact standing within a hierarchy. Genuine team building hacks this primal mechanism by completely redefining what actually grants a person's status. Instead of status being tied to individual dominance or the aggressive, selfish accumulation of power, the system is fundamentally rewired so that high status is exclusively awarded for elevating others, for catching critical mistakes before they compound into disasters, and for actively sharing vital intelligence. But there is a deeply manipulative, highly profitable, and entirely hidden dark side to this multi-billion-dollar industry. As massive corporations finally realized that cohesive teams produced exponentially higher financial yields, the core concept of team building was aggressively weaponized. Behind the glossy, highly curated veneer of colorful ping-pong tables, organic catered lunches, and mandatory off-site bonding experiences in luxury resorts lies a highly sophisticated psychological trap. Over the last 2 decades, some of the most valuable secretive tech monoliths in the world engineered environments specifically designed to completely blur the boundary between the individual's personal identity and the corporate entity. The modern tech campus was transformed into a gilded cage. They installed massive rock-climbing walls, free gourmet cafeterias, and nap pods, not because they cared about employee well-being, but because every single amenity was strategically designed to keep the employee on the physical campus for 14 hours a day. They began adopting deeply insidious language, actively referring to their exhausted workforce not as a team, but as a /family. This is not a harmless, friendly semantic shift. It is a highly calculated, deeply manipulative behavioral mechanism. When a massive, profit-driven organization successfully positions itself as a family, it radically alters the psychological contract. You do not demand overtime pay from your family. You do not draw strict, healthy boundaries around your weekend hours for your family. You gladly sacrifice your physical health, your sleep, and your actual personal relationships for your family. By manufacturing a highly intense, emotionally charged pseudo-family dynamic, ruthless corporate entities successfully extract millions of hours of unpaid, completely voluntary labor from their fiercely loyal workforce. The mandated team-building events, the expensive escape rooms, the lavish dinners, the carefully curated corporate music festivals are often not designed to foster genuine, healthy human connection. They are heavily engineered to enforce a strict, homogenized corporate culture and aggressively identify outliers. In these high-pressure environments, enthusiastic participation in forced fun becomes a highly tracked metric of loyalty. The quiet, introverted software engineer who consistently delivers completely flawless code, but respectfully declines to attend the mandatory Friday night karaoke session is quietly flagged by human resources as not being a culture fit. Their promotion is artificially delayed. Their internal influence is subtly but permanently marginalized. The modern team-building apparatus quietly becomes a blunt instrument of high-level conformity, demanding absolute, unwavering performative enthusiasm from every single employee. It successfully creates a dangerous echo chamber where valid dissent is immediately masked as toxic negativity, and authentic critical thinking is slowly smothered by a suffocating blanket of mandatory positivity. We see this exact dynamic massively manifested in catastrophic corporate collapses, where billion-dollar tech startups built entirely on fraudulent, non-functioning technology manage to survive for years simply because the internal culture of the team was so aggressively insulated and intensely bonded that no one dared to break the collective illusion. The team was built so strongly around a shared, charismatic delusion that the entire organizational structure prioritized absolute loyalty over objective reality. They ferociously defended the tribe at the ultimate cost of the truth. As we transition deeper into an entirely unprecedented digital frontier, the very foundation of how a human collective operates is undergoing a massive, terrifying mutation. The sudden, incredibly violent shift to remote work and entirely decentralized networks has entirely shattered the traditional physical architecture of team building. For decades, deep cohesion relied heavily on the sheer friction of geographic proximity. It was built in the invisible micro-interactions, the 2-minute unscripted conversations in a quiet hallway, the subtle subconscious reading of body language during a tense boardroom negotiation, the shared physical experience of enduring a high-stress, late-night sprint to meet a critical deadline. Now we are desperately attempting to bind human beings together across vast, empty digital voids. We are trying to synthetically replicate millions of years of deeply ingrained evolutionary biology through the cold, entirely sterile interface of compressed video calls and text-based instant messaging platforms. The psychological results are highly volatile and largely untested. Without the grounding reality of physical proximity, human trust degrades at a highly accelerated rate. Deep paranoia easily ferments in the absolute silence between delayed messages. We are currently witnessing the rapid rise of hypertransactional teams, massive groups of disconnected individuals who log on, silently execute highly specific parameters and log off, sharing absolutely zero social or emotional tissue. While this cold mechanical isolation can drive massive short-term efficiency, it is profoundly, dangerously brittle. When a massive crisis inevitably strikes, these highly detached, purely transactional networks immediately shatter. They completely lack the deep, invisible root systems of fierce loyalty and mutual sacrifice required to weather massive operational shocks. The rapidly approaching future of team building will absolutely not be solved by slightly better communication software or more immersive, heavily rendered virtual reality meeting rooms. It will demand a complete, radical reimagining of how we establish true psychological safety in a completely faceless environment. It will require a totally new breed of psychological architect, leaders who deeply understand how to project pure authenticity, raw vulnerability, and crystal clear intent across a massive digital divide. We are currently standing at the absolute precipice of a terrifying new sociological era, testing in real time whether the deeply primal, heavily tribal instincts of the human brain can be successfully downloaded into an entirely virtual realm without losing our fundamental humanity. The long, violent history of human progress is absolutely not a timeline of isolated, lonely geniuses having spontaneous epiphanies in dark, locked rooms. It is the complex, messy story of highly fragile, deeply flawed individuals finding extraordinary ways to bridge the vast gap between their own minds, permanently fusing their distinct neurochemistries into a singular, entirely unstoppable force. True team building is not an annoying corporate mandate or a weekend retreat. It is our ultimate, deeply biological defiance of human isolation. If uncovering the hidden psychological frameworks and decoding the highly complex systems that secretly dictate our everyday lives fascinates you, make sure to hit that subscribe button right now. Join our growing collective of curious minds as we continue to tear down the heavy illusions of the modern world, entirely deconstructing the reality around us, one invisible system at a time.